Hi, and welcome to this video. Should you use React Redux or React Context? Or is the Context API killing React Redux? These are questions you see quite a bit, and here's my take on that. And we'll actually take this application here, which uses Redux right now, and through which I'll walk you real quick, and convert it fully to the Context API so that you can see for yourselves if it's worth it, if you like that approach, and if it's better than Redux. So here we have a little demo application, link of course below the video. And this is a very simple shop, which has basically a few products here, which you can add to the cart. And you'll notice a slight delay here as I do add them. If we have a look at the cart, we see them here, also with a quantity being updated if we remove them or add them. We have a slight delay in there basically to just simulate that we're also talking to a server. I could have added a spinner or anything like that, but it's not so much about the UI here, but about the functionality. Speaking of that, if we have a look at the code, what I got in there is I'm using Redux, so I'm setting up my store here in the index.js file, and we'll have a look at these Redux files in a second. Let's first of all dive into the app. I got my app.js file in which I do set up my router, my React router here. I have two routes, one for the products page and one for the cart page. If we have a look at these routes, well, essentially in the products page, I render a list of products, which I do get from Redux with map state to props. In the main navigation, which is a separate component, I do pass my cart item number because I do show that cart item number here next to my cart link in the main navigation. So here I receive that as a prop and I do pass it in from both products and the cart page. In the cart page, I get my cart items with map state to props, and I then render my cart items here, and I got some styling and so on. Now, I do assume that you know the basics about Redux, otherwise you probably wouldn't be wondering if context is better than that. Just to give you a brief refresher on Redux and how it works. Here in the store folder, I have my Redux actions because Redux is all about dispatching actions, which then change that central store. Because in its core, the idea, the important thing about Redux is that you have one central store in your application, which you can then tap into from different parts in your app. If you want to change it, you dispatch an action. If you want to get something out of there, you use this map state to props approach. I'll come back to in a second. So I got actions in here. I am using Redux func set up here in index.js when I create my store here. And that essentially allows me to execute async code in my action creators, which are these functions where you could reach out to a web server, or as I do it here, you set some timeout to simulate an API call, as I do it here. And then after the timeout, I do dispatch my add product to cart or my remove product from cart action. Now, these actions are being dispatched from inside my app. They are made available to my components with map dispatch to props and map state to props and map dispatch to props. These are functions I define here, which I can pass to that connect higher order component, which in turn is made available by the React Redux package. And this is essentially how you connect a component to the global Redux store. This allows you to tap into it and get data or dispatch actions to it. So this is how this flow of data is. If we have a look at the reducer, which is essentially the function getting executed when an action is dispatched, in that reducer I have in here, I do have an initial state with some dummy products here in the initial state. And in that reducer function here, I do check for my two action cases, add product to cart and remove product from cart. And then I just update my cart array here to either add an item if it isn't in there already, or if it is in there already, I just update its quantity. That is essentially what I do here, and the same for removing. Feel free to go through that in detail. You do have the code after all. So this is a classic Redux setup. Let's now convert this to the Context API, which is a feature built into React. Because right now, Redux, of course, is a third-party package. I did install React Redux here, and I installed Redux and Redux Func, so free extra packages to add this functionality. And of course that adds to our bundle size, so if we can get rid of that with a reasonable effort, it might be worth it because we ship less code to our users. If we find ourselves writing a lot of extra code, we might not be doing that though, so let's find how much effort it takes. Now, the idea behind the Context API in React is that you can provide context, which essentially is just a JavaScript object, you could say. You provide it at some point in your app, could be in your root app component, could be in another component, and all child components of the component where you provide it in then have access to that context. So they have access to this JavaScript object you provide. This is kind of the idea of that central store in Redux, just a bit more flexible. Because if you want to have one central context, you can do it in your root component, in your topmost component. Or if you only need state in a part of your app, you provide that context in that part by providing it on a component a little further down in your component tree. So here I actually want to have a global state. And therefore, what I'll do is I'll add a new folder, context, to kind of differentiate it from my store folder. And I will add my shop context.js file in there. Now, I want to create my context object in this file so that I can then import it into the different parts of my app where I need to access it. So how do we create such a context in React? Well, we can simply import React from React, first of all, because the context thing is baked into React, so we need to access it on the React object. And there we have a create context function. Now, create context, this function, takes a default value as a first argument. So we can pass in a default JavaScript object, and I recommend doing that because even though you don't technically need it, as you will learn, at least not in this example, if you add it here, you get better auto-completion in your IDE, which is definitely worth it. Now, in the end, the data I want to store here is, of course, still the same data as before. I need my products and my cart array. So I will just copy that here from my store reducers file and move it into this object which I'm creating here. Now, using the context in this file would be nice, but not really. It's not really what we need to do. We will need to use this context from outside this file. We want to use it in our other components. So let's export this as a default by simply adding export default in front of that created context. Now we can import from that file. And let's import in the app.js file where I want to provide that context. Because in all child components of the app.js file, even if they're loaded via routing, I can thereafter tap into that context. So in here, let me import my shop context, and you should import this with an uppercase starting character because we'll use it like a component from, and now let's point at that context folder and then the shop context file in there. To now provide that context, you basically wrap your components that should be able to access it with shop context or whatever you named it, dot provider. You do that here around my, in this case, this routing setup so that all the loaded components loaded through these routes can tap into that. Now, here comes the cool thing. You can now set a value here, and this is the data, the concrete data that is passed down to all these components. Now, obviously, I do set a default value here, right? I do set this default value. So I wouldn't need to pass a specific value just to have that. But of course, we don't want to stay at this default value. We want to change that over time. And therefore, here in app.js, we of course don't just have to set some static one-time initial value. This is the value which, when we update it, will be passed down to the child components and will update those as well. So therefore here in my app component, I can now use my internal state, the default state I can have in any class-based component. And the same would be true if you use hooks. You can then do this with the use state hook. So here I'm using the class-based approach. Here in this state, I can now again, let's say, start with this initial setup, and therefore we could of course remove it from that shop context file or start with an empty products array here too to just have the auto-completion. Because now I will initialize this here in this state, in the app.js file. And in here, I also now want to add my add product to cart method, where I get the product as an argument, let's say. And I also want to add my remove product from cart method, where I get the product ID and then do something. So essentially, the methods I previously had in my reducer here, now these functions are added to the app.js file. And of course, that, as I mentioned before, it doesn't have to be the app.js file. It is the file where you want to provide this context. And of course, you can have multiple contexts in one and the same app. So you don't have to have one gigantic context in here. Just as you can split reducers in a Redux setup, you can have different contexts which are provided in different components. You can even create wrapper components to not clutter your app component with all the logic. So use regular React features to split that as you want. Here, I'll stay in the app.js file. And I do have my two methods here. And in my value here, I will now pass in a JavaScript object, hence the double curly braces. First pair sets up a dynamic value. Inner pair then creates a JavaScript object. And I want to pass down my products, which refer to this state products. I want to pass down my cart, which refers to this state cart. So to my state values. And now comes the fun part. I want to be able to call these methods from inside other components. So from the components that receive my context. To make this possible, I just have to add references to these methods into my context object down there. So besides passing products and cart, I will now also add product to cart. And you can name this whatever you want. And this should point at this add product to cart. So it should point at this method. Important, don't execute it here. You don't want to run it immediately when this is parsed. Instead, you just want to pass a reference so that this is executed when add product to cart is called from inside a child component, just as you would pass a reference to an on-click listener, for example. Now, I'll do the same for removing. So remove product from cart will point at this remove product from cart, also without parentheses. Now to get better auto-completion, I will also add this to my default value here, add product to cart. And this here will just be an empty method which does nothing, and I simply add it here to get better auto-completion. That's all. So remove product from cart is added there as well. And I do get my product here though, and here I will get a product ID. And with this setup added, we got our core state setup. Now let's add some functionality to add product to cart and remove product from cart. So for now, I will simply console log adding product and basically just output my product here and do the same for removing so that we can see if that was triggered correctly. So removing product with ID, and then here we can concatenate our product ID. So now we should be able to see these console logs. But of course, for that, we now need to access that context from the child components because we're still working in the app.js and the root component only. Let's start with products where we want to add our product to the cart. First of all, I will get rid of connect down there. This is a React Redux thing and we don't need it anymore. So I can get rid of that. You could now delete map state to props and map dispatch to props. I'll comment it out so that we have it here for reference, but we won't need it anymore. Instead, in here, in the products page, we now want to access our context. By the way, let me comment these unused imports out as well. So we want to use our context in here. And now we have two ways of tapping into the context. Both ways require us to import our context. So let's do that first. I'll import my shop context, and you can name it here as you want. Doesn't have to have the same name as an app.js, because it still will point at the same object. I import my shop context by going up into the context folder and then to the shop context file. Now, method one of importing it, or of using it, is that we use it down there where we return the JSX code for this component, and you can use this in a functional component as well. You use your shop context and then add consumer. We had .provider in app.js. Here we can add .consumer. We wrap our entire JSX code with that, and in there we get a so-called render prop, which means we have a dynamic content in here, which will be a JavaScript function that should return the JSX code we want to render for this component. So what we previously had returned in our render method, we add this now here in this function we have between our curly braces, like this. And there we receive context as an argument. And this refers to our object as we pass it here into the provider. So we have access to exactly this object in our products page now. And this means that there, for example, where I want to output my card item number, I can now tap into my context, get access to the card, and use the same logic I had down there. Here I had this reduce function added to calculate the quantity of items. So let me bring that up there. Comment these parts back in, of course. So now what I have here is my main navigation gets the card item number, which in the end taps into the context, there into this card array, and reduces this array to a single number that indicates how many items are in the cart by adding the quantity of each item, and starting with a quantity of 0, of course. Now, this is one part. We also want to go through all our products. And for this, here again, we just use that context argument we're getting here. There I can access the products, because if you have a look at the app.js file, we do have a products field on our context. And then we can read all the values in there. And of course, here I want to add a product to the cart, so I can just use context add product to cart, because I have the add product to cart function here, or method, here in my context object. If we save all of that, we go to products and reload this page. Let's open our developer tools in the JavaScript console, and let's click add to cart. And you should be seeing adding product, and then this gaming mouse here, or the plastic bottle. So this seems to work, as you can tell. And this is now using the Conext API, only in the product page thus far. Hence, we see no update here in the cart. We also haven't added any logic to really do something on the cart here in app.js. Now, I also mentioned that this is only one way of adding the context here with consumer. The advantage of this approach is that it works in both class-based and functional components. The downside is that this only gives you access to the context in your render part, where you render your JSX code. If you need access to the context in component.mount or in the constructor, then you're lost. This will not work there. So let's have a look at approach number 2 in the cart page. Again, I want to access my context. I want to use it. So let's import shop context from, and go into the context folder and import it from the shop context file. And now, instead of using context, shop context consumer, which we could do, let's use an approach which will only work in class-based components, not in functional components. We can add a static property to this class-based component by adding the static keyword, and then this property has to be named context type. Important. This requires React version 16.6 or higher. It will not work in lower versions. You set this equal to shop context, so to the context you imported. Behind the scenes, React will now connect to this context and give you access to a special this context property, which is made available by React, which gives you access to that context object passed down through this context. Now, if you have multiple contexts you want to access in this component, you need to get creative and, for example, create some wrapper components or anything like that. So here, we now have access to this context, which means we could now also use our context in component.mount, for example. So if I added this here and I console log this context, if I save that and I go to the cart component, indeed here I see my context object being logged with the default products. So this is pretty nice. We now don't have to use context consumer down there. Instead here, where I want to get that cart item count, Well, instead of using connect here, we can get rid of that. And therefore, instead of using map dispatch to props and map state to props, I can again use this reduce function on my card and use it up there and access this context, dot card reduce, and comment this back in, just as I did before, but now not with the consumer, but with this context made available by the static context type here. And I can do this anywhere where I need data from my context, like here, where I want to get my card items. Now, I can access this context card, because here I did rename it to card items when I used Redux. It's all in that card array we have in the context though. The same down there. This context card allows me to tap into the items that are in the card. And if I want to remove an item, I can execute this context remove product from card. And here I do pass in that ID I want to remove with the bind method. Now let me remove the unused imports here as well. And if we now save this on that card page, we of course have no items in there to see if that works. So let's finish this up by going to the reducer. And there, in my add product to cart case, this essentially is the logic I now want to copy and add to app.js to my add product to cart function in there. So in here, I will create a new constant, updated cart and updated item index. There, I want to access my current cart from this state. And I no longer get an action with a payload. Instead here, I do get my product as an argument. I do expect to get that. And I can access the ID on that, since every product has an ID in this application. I then do update my cart by pushing a new item onto it if this item hasn't been added to it before. And instead of action payload, I just push the product I'm getting as an argument. I set the quantity to 1 there. And if I had this item in the cart already, I just increase the quantity. Now let me also copy the logic for removing an item here from the remove product from cart case. Let's copy all of that. Go back to app.js, and in remove product from cart, I'll add this here. Add a const keyword in front of updated cart and in front of updated item index. Here we access this state cart, and we do get our product ID as an argument here. Now then we update the cart. In both cases, I now want to update the state of app.js because this is where I manage that data I do pass down through the context. Remember here, I'm just accessing my state to get the data I pass in my context object. Hence, I need to update the state of this component to update what I pass down with context. So here in add product, I can call this set state, and I set cart here to my updated cart. I don't need to touch my products there because I don't change them here. In remove product from cart, it's the same. I just set my cart to the updated cart. With that, I should have logic in there that works. So let's save all files. If I now click add to product, I got this instant update because I removed that delay. I'll re-add it. And in the cart page, we see it there as well. Now if I add more gaming mouses here, we see that is grouped together and I can remove items. That all updates correctly, also in the header. Now to reintroduce that timeout, you don't need a special middleware for that as you needed it for Redux. You can simply add it here in the function that executes. So in add to cart, add product to cart. If you want to make sure that this happens only after a small timeout, you can just add set timeout here and do your state update only after that time. Of course, this is just some dummy code. In reality, you would not set a timeout. You would be making an HTTP request at the beginning and then update your state in the then block or anything like that. So let me do the same here now for removing a product from the cart. Let's add a function that will execute after these 700 milliseconds. And with this tiny change, if I go back to products, now you will see it doesn't update immediately in the header. It takes a short while because of that delay I did add. But other than that, it of course works the same. So that is the context added here, the context replacing Redux. We could now remove that store folder, all Redux imports. We can now remove Redux Func, Redux, and React Redux from the package, and we therefore have way less dependencies to achieve basically the same. Downsides would be that if you have a lot of global state, you will end up with a huge app component, or you create a dedicated component that holds your state and passes it down as props to the component it wraps, and the app component would be that wrapped component, and that could then remove logic from your app component. Let me actually show you that. For that, I'll add it here in the context folder. I'll have my global state component. You can name it whatever you want. And in there, we can import React and component from React like this. And then I want to add my class, global state. And you can name this whatever you want. It doesn't have to be named global state. And here I extend component. And in my render function, I now just want to return this props children. So whatever I pass between the opening and closing tag of the global state component when I use it. The interesting part is that I will now add the logic I had here in app.js for the state and these methods here. I will cut that from app.js and add it to the global state so that all the logic is in here. And I will export my global state, of course, as a default in that file. So export default global state. And now we have that logic in the global state. In app.js, I now can remove that shop context import. And instead here in global state, I want to import shop context from the shop context file, which is in the same folder as global state. Because here, I will actually now not just return this props children, but I will wrap that robber. I will wrap it with shop context provider, because you have to remember that the provider provides the context, which I have to pass here through the value, to all its children. And if I now use that global state as a wrapper around my app component or around whatever I have here, then still all the child components there have access to that state, but that logic for that state is now not packed into the app component, but outsourced. Technically, the result will be the same, but it gives you cleaner code and allows you to split your code more elegantly. So that is possible with the context. So the downside of having a big app.js file isn't really there. Let me show you how this would work. I now just need to import my global state component from the context file and there from global state. And then I will cut my value object here because I need it in a second. But I can then wrap my router here with global state and also close that here. So now I'm wrapping my router with just global state. And in global state, here, that value I pass to my shop context provider is that object I just cut from app.js, where I refer to the products and cart state of the global state component and where I add these methods. And global state is really just a normal React component, right? I do extend component. I just use it as a wrapper component to do all that state management and have all the state management code in there so that my app component can stay lean. And with that, a lot of talking, if I save that and the app reloads, it still works as before because we didn't change anything logically, just make our code a little bit easier to read. So, should you always use the Context API then? Well, on the first look, it might look like an obvious answer. Sure, you should. It's relatively easy to use. It saves you the extra dependency and therefore probably also shrinks your bundle size. And why wouldn't you use it if it's baked into React? Well, let's have a look at a quote from someone involved with the development of React. And therefore certainly someone who has some insights into what happens behind the scenes. And there we learned that even people in the React team are not convinced that you should use the Context API for high-frequency updates. For low-frequency changes, like the user picked a different theme, the user logged in, or the user changed the locale of that application, it might be great. But due to the way the Context API works internally, where React essentially has to traverse the entire tree of components it constructs to detect state changes and handle them, roughly speaking, because of that, it's not ideal to use the Context API with a global state for high-frequency changes. So you should definitely not store every keystroke made by a user in the Context API. Now, that of course does not mean you should never use the Context API. Use it with care. Use it for low-frequency updates, so for state changes that don't occur multiple times per second, and definitely consider it for these use cases. Maybe you can store or handle the high-frequency updates differently with props or inside of your component. Then you still might not need Redux, and the thing where you would have used it otherwise can be replaced with the Context API. But if you're building an app where you're storing a lot in Redux, and amongst all that state and data, also things that change frequently, in cases like this, you might consider not using the Context API for that, but stick to Redux. Because the Context API is really just not built as a replacement for Redux. That's not its core idea. That is not the reason why it was added to React. And therefore, don't use it for this, but consider it for the use cases I mentioned before, mostly low-frequency updates. And there, it's great to use and definitely a great replacement for Redux.